Imagine waking up one morning, turning on your computer, and seeing something that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. The familiar Windows logo appears, but underneath it, a message quietly reads that your system is now running in Microsoft Linux mode by default. No dramatic announcement, no giant keynote reveal, just a silent shift that changes everything people thought they knew about personal computing. For decades, Windows and Linux stood on opposite sides of the technology world, almost like rivals locked in an endless battle for dominance. Windows represented commercial software, polished interfaces, and mainstream adoption. Linux represented freedom, customization, and the power of open-source collaboration. These two systems shaped the modern computing landscape in completely different ways, each attracting loyal communities that often viewed the other side with skepticism. The idea that Microsoft, the company once considered Linux's biggest enemy, could build a future centered around Linux would have sounded absurd. But technology has a strange way of rewriting history. The impossible often becomes inevitable when market forces, developer needs, and strategic survival all align. Over the last decade, Microsoft has transformed from a company obsessed with protecting Windows at all costs into one that increasingly embraces open source technology. This shift was subtle at first, but over time it became impossible to ignore. When Microsoft introduced the Windows subsystem for Linux, many people thought it was simply a convenience feature for developers. It allowed Linux tools to run inside Windows, making it easier for programmers to work across ecosystems. It seemed practical, even innovative, but few realized it might represent the first step towards something much bigger. Then came deeper integrations. Microsoft launched its own Linux distributions for cloud infrastructure, embraced open source development on platforms like GitHub, and became one of the largest contributors to Linux-related projects. These weren't isolated experiments. They were signs of a deeper transformation in Microsoft's philosophy. Now imagine that transformation reaching its final stage. Imagine Microsoft introducing a fully integrated Linux mode so seamless that most users would never realize they had crossed into open source territory. The interface would still feel familiar. The productivity tools would still work, but underneath, the system would no longer rely on the aging architecture of traditional Windows. This isn't just a fascinating thought experiment. It may actually represent the most logical path forward for Microsoft. And if it happens, it could mark the beginning of the biggest operating system shift in tech history. One so significant that it could effectively kill Windows as we know it forever. To understand why this could happen, we need to look at the uncomfortable truth Microsoft faces today. Windows, despite its massive install base, is becoming increasingly difficult to evolve. The operating system carries decades of legacy code, compatibility layers, and architectural decisions made in a completely different era of computing. Every major Windows update is like renovating an ancient skyscraper while people are still living inside it. Engineers must preserve compatibility with software written decades ago while trying to modernize the experience for today's users. This balancing act creates complexity that slows innovation and increases technical debt. Linux doesn't carry the same burden. Its modular architecture allows for flexibility, adaptability, and cleaner evolution over time. It can be customized for everything from smartphones to supercomputers. It powers most of the internet, dominates cloud infrastructure, and serves as a foundation for Android, the world's most popular mobile operating system. Microsoft knows this better than anyone. Its Azure cloud platform relies heavily on Linux. In fact, a huge percentage of workloads running on Azure already use Linux-based systems. This means Microsoft is deeply invested in Linux infrastructure, even if the average Windows user never sees it. That creates an interesting contradiction. Microsoft's future growth increasingly depends on technologies outside traditional Windows. The company's most profitable services, from cloud computing to enterprise solutions, often benefit more from Linux than from Microsoft's own desktop operating system. This raises a critical question. If Linux is already central to Microsoft's future, why continue treating Windows as an entirely separate ecosystem? Why maintain two fundamentally different worlds when convergence could create enormous advantages? A Microsoft Linux mode could solve this problem elegantly. Instead of abandoning Windows overnight, Microsoft could gradually evolve it into a Linux-powered platform while preserving the familiar interface users expect. The transition could happen in stages, almost invisibly. At first, Linux mode might appear as an optional feature designed for developers and power users. It would offer better performance, improved resource efficiency, and enhanced compatibility with modern development tools. Early adopters would test it, refine it, and help shape its future. As confidence grows, Microsoft could expand Linux mode to mainstream consumers. Office applications would run natively. Gaming support would improve dramatically through technologies like Proton and DirectX compatibility layers. The average user would experience faster boot times, better battery life, and fewer disruptive updates. Eventually, the distinction between Windows mode and Linux mode could disappear entirely. The underlying system would become Linux-based by default. While Microsoft's proprietary interface and ecosystem services continue delivering the familiar experience users expect, up to that point, Windows wouldn't truly be dead in the branding sense. The name might remain. The interface could still resemble modern Windows, but under the hood, the operating system would have fundamentally transformed into something else entirely. This would represent more than a technical upgrade. It would be a complete philosophical reversal for Microsoft, a company once defined by its opposition to open source software. And yet, it would also be the culmination of trends already visible today. One of the strongest reasons this shift could happen is performance. Traditional Windows it consumes significant memory, background processes often drain system resources, and updates can interrupt workflows at the worst possible moments. Linux-based systems are generally leaner and more efficient. They can deliver strong performance even on modest hardware. This efficiency could allow Microsoft to extend device lifespans, improve battery performance on laptops, and create smoother experiences across all hardware tiers. For consumers, this would mean older PCs staying useful for longer. Budget laptops could perform far better than they do under current Windows versions. Premium devices could achieve new levels of responsiveness and endurance. In a world increasingly focused on sustainability and reducing electronic waste, this matters. If Microsoft could extend the useful life of millions of devices simply by changing the operating system foundation, it would create both environmental and economic benefits. Security is another major factor. Windows has long been the primary target for malware and cyber attacks, due to its massive market share and architectural complexity. While Microsoft has made enormous progress in security, the system remains an attractive target. Linux's permission structures, open source transparency, and modular design offer strong security advantages. Vulnerabilities are often identified and patched rapidly by a global community of contributors. This collaborative model creates resilience difficult for closed systems to match. A Microsoft Linux mode could combine Linux's architectural strengths with Microsoft's enterprise-grade security expertise. The result might be one of the most secure consumer operating systems ever created. Then there's software development. Developers increasingly prefer cross-platform tools, containerized environments, and open. Linux aligns naturally with these trends. Windows often requires additional layers to support them effectively. By shifting toward Linux, Microsoft could make its platform dramatically more attractive to modern developers. This would strengthen the software ecosystem, encourage innovation, and help ensure relevance in an industry increasingly shaped by open standards. Gaming presents perhaps the most fascinating challenge. For years, gaming has been Windows' strongest advantage. DirectX dominance and broad compatibility made Windows the default choice for PC gamers worldwide, but that advantage is weakening. Valve's investment in Proton has dramatically improved Linux gaming compatibility. The Steam Deck proved Linux can deliver mainstream gaming experiences. Developers are becoming more comfortable targeting multiple platforms. If Microsoft integrated Linux while preserving DirectX compatibility, it could create a gaming platform with the best of both worlds. Better performance efficiency, stronger system stability, and access to both native Linux innovations and existing Windows game libraries. Such a move could reshape the gaming industry overnight. Developers would no longer need to prioritize traditional Windows architecture. Linux compatibility would become standard, accelerating broader ecosystem adoption. This would trigger ripple effects across the entire software world. Application developers, hardware manufacturers, enterprise IT departments, and educational institutions would all adapt to the new reality. Open source software would gain unprecedented legitimacy in mainstream consumer computing. The barriers between proprietary and open ecosystems would blur. Innovation could accelerate as developers build on shared foundations rather than isolated silos. Competitors would feel the impact immediately. Apple, long differentiated by its Unix-based foundation and tight ecosystem integration, would face a Microsoft platform capable of delivering similar architectural advantages with far broader hardware flexibility. Google would also need to respond. Chrome relies heavily on Linux simplicity and efficiency as key selling points. A Linux-powered Microsoft platform could undercut those advantages while offering richer software compatibility. The broader industry could shift toward a future where operating systems compete primarily through interface design, ecosystem services, and user experience rather than fundamentally different technical foundations. In some ways, this mirrors what happened in the smartphone world. Most Android devices share Linux roots, yet manufacturers differentiate through software layers, design choices, and ecosystem integration. Desktop computing could evolve similarly. Of course, such a transformation wouldn't happen without resistance. Many users are deeply attached to traditional Windows. Enterprises rely on legacy applications and established work. Hardware vendors optimize around existing assumptions. Microsoft would need an extraordinarily careful transition strategy. Compatibility layers would have to be nearly flawless. Migration tools would need to simplify adoption. Communication would require clarity and reassurance. Any significant disruption could trigger backlash. Users remember failed transitions like Windows 8, where interface changes alienated large portions of the customer base. Microsoft cannot afford another misstep on that scale. This is why Linux mode makes strategic sense as a gradual evolution rather than an abrupt replacement. It allows Microsoft to test, refine, and build trust over time. Think of it like replacing the engine of an airplane mid-flight. The passengers shouldn't feel turbulence. Ideally, they shouldn't even notice until the benefits become obvious. That level of engineering challenge is enormous, but Microsoft has the resources and expertise to attempt it. Few companies possess the technical depth, market reach, and ecosystem control necessary for such a transition. And perhaps more importantly, Microsoft has strong incentives to make it happen. The future of computing is changing rapidly. Cloud-native applications, AI-driven workflows, edge computing, and cross-platform interoperability all favor flexible, modular foundations. Traditional Windows architecture wasn't designed for this future. Linux was. If Microsoft clings too tightly to legacy systems, it risks becoming constrained by its own history. If it embraces transformation, it could redefine personal computing for decades to come. There's also a symbolic dimension to this possibility. A Microsoft Linux mode would represent one of the most dramatic ideological reversals in technology history. This is the same company whose former leadership once described Linux as a threat, the same company that built its empire on proprietary software dominance. For it to embrace Linux as the foundation of its flagship platform would signal a profound shift in how technology companies compete. It would reflect a broader industry lesson. Adaptability matters more than ideology. The companies that survive are those willing to evolve, even when evolution means abandoning one's sacred assumptions. For longtime Linux advocates, this scenario would feel surreal. What was once a niche movement driven by passionate communities could become the default foundation for billions of devices. For Windows loyalists, it might feel unsettling at first, but if executed well, many might never notice anything beyond improved performance, reliability, and flexibility. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. The death of Windows might not look like collapse or failure. It might look like seamless transformation. No dramatic ending. No public funeral for one of computing's most iconic brands. Just a quiet evolution where the old Windows gradually fades into something new, until one day people realize the operating system they thought they knew no longer exists in its original form. History is full of technologies that survived by reinventing themselves. IBM transformed from hardware giant to enterprise services powerhouse. Apple reinvented itself from struggling computer company to consumer electronics titan. Microsoft has already shown a remarkable capacity for reinvention under modern leadership. It's shifted from software licensing, dependence, toward cloud services, subscriptions, and platform ecosystems. A Linux-powered future would simply be the next chapter in that story. And if it happens, future generations may look back on today's Windows as we look back on early DOS systems. Important, foundational, but ultimately a stepping stone towards something better. The biggest operating system shift in tech history may already be underway, hidden in plain sight through every Linux integration, every open source contribution, every subtle architectural decision Microsoft makes. The question is no longer whether Microsoft can build this future. The pieces already exist. The real question is when the company will decide the time is right to bring them together. When that moment comes, it could redefine not just Microsoft, but the entire relationship between proprietary software and open source via the boundaries that once defined computing's great operating system wars could dissolve. What remains would be a new era built less on rivalry and more on convergence. And in that world, Windows wouldn't disappear because it lost. It would disappear because it evolved. The operating system that once dominated personal computing through closed control might ultimately survive by embracing openness. The very philosophy it once resisted could become the key to its next era of dominance. That irony would be almost poetic. The fall of Windows, if it happens, may not be a story of defeat. It may be the greatest reinvention in technology history. And somewhere in that future, millions of users may boot up their computers, launch their favorite apps, and go about their day without ever realizing they're witnessing one of the most important transformations computing has ever seen. Because the most revolutionary changes often happen quietly, not with explosions, but with a single line of code that changes everything forever.